All right, we're live on YouTube.
Well, a warm welcome to everyone for our COZ session this afternoon. And we're delighted that it's the second of two sessions devoted to the music of the Israeli composer Josef Tal. I'm Malcolm Miller, and I'm delighted to be chairing this amazing session, which we have no less than 3 speakers, plus more distinguished guests who are going to speak to us. And we're going to talk about some aspects of Josef Tal's life and work. And you'll remember from last week, Josef Tal's life spanned the 20th century from 1910 to 2008. And his biography, which you can read on the website, which we're going to discuss in a minute, explains how he came in 1934 from Berlin to British Mandate Palestine, setting up the first Israeli electronic music studios, about which we'll hear more later. Well, without going into more detail, I'd like to actually introduce our 3 speakers. We're going to start with Dr. Joseph Goldenberg, who is a teacher at the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance, where he's also the director of the library there. And he is a theorist of music and has written extensively on composers in Israel, but also music of the Western European canon. A number of articles have appeared in different books, and he's also been a contributor to the book on Ze'evi, which has been edited by Professor Hirshberg. We also have another contributor to that book, and also to this book on Josef Tal, which we mentioned last week as being in production, hopefully to appear later this year. And that is Dr. Leiran Gurkovic, who received his PhD with a thesis on the orchestral works of Paul Ben Chaim, another of Israel's leading composers, under the supervision of Michael Volpe, who in fact was our speaker last week. And Dr. Gurkiewicz has written on Ben Chaim to a great extent, and one of his essays is about to appear in a Munich publication in July 2020 this year, and it will deal with Ben Chaim's German songs. And our third speaker is Dr. Shoshana Ze'evi, who is a graduate of the Department of Hebrew Literature at Tel Aviv University. And her study was of Yaakov Shabtai and Yonatan Ratosh. And she's now a member of the musicology department in Tel Aviv and has been studying the operas of Josef Tal, which is, I believe, her subject in the forthcoming book. So we're delighted to be going to hear from those speakers later on. But I'd like to now also introduce the eminent musicologist, Yehoash Hirshberg, who last week gave us a talk about Tal's works, and who is editing the book, which is going to appear this year on Tal's music. And I believe Professor Hirshberg, who's here right now, is going to also introduce to us the son of the composer Josef Tal. And I wanted to say that we were delighted to have the knowledge of the website for Josef Tal, so that for this week, hopefully, some of us will have listened to the works which we're about to discuss. And if you haven't done so already, we'll be able to do that following this session. So over to you, Yehoash. And I hope that also everybody, when I say it now, will think if you have some questions along the way, keep them in mind. And then following our 3 speakers, we'll have a chance to discuss things. Thank you very much indeed. Yehoash. If you can unmute, that would be. Yehoash, you're not unmuted, sorry. Just to say, we would love to hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Malcolm, for organizing the 2 sessions on Josef Tal, which were organized on the occasion of the turning of the book on Josef Tal to the Carmel edition in Jerusalem. They have just started doing the typesetting and preparing this elaborate, very big book for publication later this year. And I would like also to introduce Eitan Tal, the composer's son. You see him here. And Eitan did a marvelous job building a big internet site on Josef Tal. Maybe you can just tell us how to get to this site. Eitan, we don't hear you.
You hear me now?
Now we hear you.
Yeah. I would like to thank you all for this wonderful occasion, for the initiative and participation of all of you. I cannot really contribute anything to you to this Zoom meeting, except my gratitude. And actually, this is the first premiere of my father's work in Zoom. So that's a good occasion to celebrate. Thank you all again.
And can you tell us how to get to the site?
The site is www.joseftal.org. Joseph, Joseftal. That's all, very simple.
It's very simple. Yeah. And the Eitan's site is incredibly helpful because it has recordings of all his music. And with Tal, reading the score is not always easy. And when you talk about electronic music, of course, there is no score, but you can, and you are welcome to listen to each piece before you read about it and get this incredible variety of works of this very prolific composer. Last week, I spoke about the operas, which were Tal's most important field, and Professor Michael Volpe presented the 6 symphonies, which are very important. And today we'll meet the other 2 colleagues who shared me with the book. And it was so important for me to work with them. And Joseph Goldenberg will speak about Tal's most complicated orchestral work, the double concerto for violin and cello. It's a really long and elaborate piece. Then we will hear Leiran Gurkovic, who will speak about Tal's electronic music. He was one of the pioneers of electronic music in the world. And last one, we'll hear Shoshana Ze'evi, who will speak about Tal's dedication to Else Lasker Schüler. So I would like to turn the microphone now to Joseph Goldenberg about the double concerto, please.
Let's start with a trivia question. Perhaps Eitan will know the answer. When did Josef Tal meet Sephardic Rabbi Ovadia Yosef? The answer is they were both awarded the Israel Prize in 1970, also along with poet Leiran Gurkovic, who died several months earlier. This was 1 year after Tal composed the one-movement double concerto for violin and cello, premiered in 1970 with Pinchas Zuckerman and Uzi Wiesel as soloist under Gary Bertini. This is a tightly modernistic piece. I wonder whether it is rewarding to study it in the context of Israeli or Jewish music instead of the context of international modernistic masterpieces. It deserves to be studied by any proponent of Schoenberg's school, for example. It is evident that the concerto combines two opposing aspects of compositional process. On the one hand, there are elements that are the product of very careful, meticulous compositional plans, mainly dodecaphonic. Some, but not all, sections of the work are dodecaphonic. The influence of these aspects of the listening experience is limited, however. On the other hand, there are multiple elements that crop up and affect listening experience, for example, concerning rhythms, contours, or textures, but these seem to be the product of ad hoc compositional drives, more improvisatory. This duality is not unique to Tal. I think, for example, of Schoenberg's Wind Quintet, a really communicative work, and existing painstaking analysis focus on those aspects that reflect the compositional process, but not on other aspects that are more catching for the ear. I hope to demonstrate today both aspects, the planned and the improvisatory. For this, let us look in detail first at the opening of the work. Tal notated the concerto in extremely large measures in the tempo of 1/8 = 72. This is somewhat annoying to the eye, and I have renotated it 4 times slower with every beat in the original notation as a complete measure. Okay. Never mind, we hear it again. Okay, so first of all, I have found the beginning is in 12-tone music, a 12-tone series. I found it myself. I did not read anywhere, but I see that it starts pum, pum, pum with 3 chords. The first chord has 3 notes, and we can see that F sharp, C, B flat are the three first tones of the melodic module by the soloist just after this. And when I tried to find the exact series, I found that it matches almost exactly, not entirely exactly, and later appearances of this series always change. There are slight changes in the order of this tone or that tone, and I have a guess that this is a part of a larger plan that I did not fully detect, but I'm not sure it really matters. I suspect whether it really matters. And later we shall speak of other aspects that are more audible in this theme, in this series of motifs that becomes a multi-motivic theme. As a student, I have been exposed to 2 approaches to serial writings. My teacher, Chaim Permont, told us that serial writing, what it is about is to set us free from taking care for pitch organization altogether. and thus let us focus on other musical factors. But Professor Mark Kopitman taught otherwise, and this is indeed how Schoenberg works and also Josef Tal. He proposed a meticulous study of the features of the individual series in order to plan the specific transpositions and forms of the series to be in use, for example, in order to get invariant relations. So first of all, let's look at the series, the basic form of the series. It has some special features. It has almost all intervals. It includes several tritones and augmented triad. Augmented triad is symmetrical and it works in all forms of the series. Inversion, retrograde, we shall always hear augmented triads. Also diminished triad is symmetrical. And the first four tones, and the first penultimate, the four penultimate tones, number 8 to 11 in the series, are related by a transposition of the mirror inversion. Like if I do this, I take it a whole tone upper, so I start in G sharp, and then the mirror inversion, G sharp, D, E, F, and these are invariant, these are related. And here is a moment where the transpositions are calculated. So there is E flat, A, G, F sharp in both the violin solo and the cello solo, and it is sort of heterophonic, but it is not the same form of the series, but rather this is one transposition of the inversion. This is another transposition of the primary form of the series. They're calculated so that the same tones occur by the same time. And this ought to be a sort of heterophony. Now it is a very large intellectual pleasure to find such moment in the score, but does it, to what extent is it audible? One moment, I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, I did share sound. So invariant relations between forms of the series can be very audible in slow tempo, in closed registration, but in such a setting, it seems to me more kind of intellectual play. However, the theme does include other aspects that are indeed more audible. After three chords, each one takes a beat or a subbeat in the original notation, pom, 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 and pom in the tom-tom. Then the soloists enter without accompaniment, very remote from one another. They start very remote. Then they get very close to one another in the same register. And this is T da 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 di da da da. This is a Shostakovich signature in the octatonic tetrachord. Then we have pom 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 pom. They are both in the same register in agitated, repeated tone. And yes, this is according to the rules of the dodecaphonic play. One can repeat one and the same note several times, but it is very perceptible. And then as a quintuplet, it also includes a shift in the meter, pom, 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 and a flageolet. These are aspects that are indeed audible and catch the ear. Now we should look at several moments that use, and some portions of the concerto are not dodecaphonic, or more use scales, and they are more reminiscent of Bartók, perhaps even Mahler. Okay. Now, what does catch the ear? If the dodecaphonic calculations are more intellectual play, there are elements that seem like little surprises that crop up. For example, momentary imitations. listen to that one. What is imitated here is actually ascending glissando, which can work with any pair of tones, but this is a compositional drive, and it is not working throughout the work, but this is a little games, that momentary imitations that really are nice to listen to. From time to time, there are solo percussions, which are indeed a non-pitched percussion which live off the pitch organization aspects, but the contour, we hear a trumpet, da-da-da-da-dum, and then the two percussion instrument imitate only the contour, and it's like a shadow of what we heard just a moment earlier. Also, we recall that element, the agitated, immediate, repeated notes. This is an element that is worked out rather considerably. Both the quintuplet and this titata, we skipped here several stages in the, but there is a good case to think that this is related to the to the agitated repeat. And each time there are no simple repeat ever. These repeats, mostly the soloist, where the small chamber moments where with the soloist are more rich in such moments, but sometimes also in the climaxes there are elements that do you hear the repeated tones in quintuplet. This is sort of development of the elements that we heard before, and here is quintuplet in large descent that will also repeat in the very last moment of the piece. Okay, one aspect of form in the traditional sense is the existence of a recapitulation. When I let you hear it just after you heard the beginning, the recapitulation is noticeable, but in real-time listening, it is buried among many other moments that gain salience. For me, it took many listenings with score to notice it. Multiple changes occur from the beginning of the piece to the beginning of the recapitulation, to the extent that they threaten the perception of the opening of the concerto and the opening of the recapitulation as analogous moments. Some modification techniques might also happen in traditional recapitulations, even in Haydn, while others do not, and especially the coexistence of so many changes together is overwhelming. I think we shall end. I shall end my talk with a slightly longer excerpt that from the beginning of the recapitulation, just to let you know there are internal expansions for each motivic module, because the theme is not based on a single motive. There are many motives. Each of them is expanded in the recapitulation. There are metrical shifts, interpolations of climaxes, not a simple interpolation of a passage, but sometimes the interpolated material is so salient that it changes the experience of its being interpolation, changing the order of the material, splitting the large multi-motivic theme into sub-rotations, simultaneization, so to speak, making simultaneous materials previously heard separately, and also the overlap with earlier and later units. So all these make very complex. And we shall end with hearing about 2.5 minutes from the recapitulation. Now this is an overlap continuation of the previous material. The agitated and the flageolet. The Shostakovich signature that earlier put before the agitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Josef Goldenberg for a really stimulating introduction to that very, very complex and lovely, wonderful concerto. And I think if anyone would like to address some questions, I would keep them for later. But that was a good opportunity to hear, as well as to learn a lot about the content of Josef Tal's writing and his some of his techniques. So thank you so much. Shall we move on then at this point to Leiran Gurkovic, who's going to talk about the electronic works. If I can ask maybe if Josef can mute and Leiran can unmute, we can switch over screens and we'll come back to everybody at the end of the session, as I said. So Leiran, if you can unmute and is Leiran here?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent.
Okay.
Thank you. Do you need to share your, it's a little bit quiet actually, if you can, maybe it's a directional thing. Do you need to share a screen?
Yeah, I will.
The sound is a little bit bubbly.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, that's a bit better. If you come closer, thanks. Okay, over to you, Leiran. Thank you so much. So you.
Is it on full screen? Can you?
It's not on the slideshow yet. Do you want to do it on?
It is now. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So the chapter I wrote deals with Tal's 4 concertos for keyboard and magnetic tape. I would say that these concertos, there are 3 of them that are for piano and 1 for harpsichord, and they are quite unique in Tal's repertoire, since they represent, in my opinion, an especially experimental approach from the composer's part. In fact, I would say that there are 4 different experiments, with each work exploring the different facets and aspects of modernism. Now, electronic music at the time, we must bear in mind, that was in the 1960s, was still in its first steps. And as far as exploring the dialectics of electronic music and acoustic musics, Tal is considered to be at the forefront of composers in this genre. The unique result that Tal achieved in his works is derived from the close affinities that he created between the acoustic instrument, the piano that is, and the magnetic tape. Tal's advantage probably is derived from his pianistic abilities and his vast knowledge of the piano literature. Of course, we must also, I should mention that in their different experiments, such important composers, such as Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, John Cage, Pierre-Henry, or Henry Scheffer, they all endowed secondary power to the piano in their compositions. The piano there is only a part of a whole. For example, Stockhausen's Kontakte. Tal gives a very special and elaborate part to the piano. In that sense, it's a real concerto with 2 bodies of two different solo instruments. Maybe one would say that, or in confrontation with each other, or dialogue. So the first composition Tal had in 1962, he completes his fourth piano concerto after receiving Eula Kane's revolutionary multi-track synthesizer, which of course does not look anything like what we know or imagine to be a synthesizer today. In terms of the compositional technique that Tal was relying on, it is not a strictly dodecaphonic piece or serial, but he definitely does rely on these techniques to some degree. In my opinion, pitch class set is a good description of his technique in these compositions. What is unusual, I would say, about the 4th piano concerto is the fact that Tal incorporates into it the human voice, a sung phrase which appears only 5 minutes, 23 seconds into the piece. And actually, the entire concerto is constructed on this sung phrase, which appears only at 5 minutes. And it has some interesting complexities and dualities. I would like us now to listen to the phrase that appears, as I've mentioned, at 5 minutes. So the sung phrase has only 2 words in it, Sheba Shamayim Uva'aretz, in heaven and in earth. And of course, as you can see, when the text says in heaven, we are ascending in an upward motion, and Uva'aretz, to the earth, we are descending. Now this motif is very unusual, or this theme, which has perhaps 2 motifs into it. The first one is even more, I would say, actually constructed, as we can see, on the 3rd and the 2nd, F-A-B. This is one of the better known motifs, I would say, that relates to Jewish musics, to Jewish cantillations and the folk musics of Israel. It was used by Ernest Bloch in his Avodat HaKodesh, in his sacred service. Paul Ben Chaim uses it in his Yoram Oratoria, which he wrote shortly before emigrating from Nazi Germany. It was elaborately mentioned in Avraham Tzvi Hillson's books, the famous, very known ethnomusicologist. Now, accidentally or not, Josef Tal at that point was studying Hillson's books, by his own admission, of course, as he tells about it in his biography. Now, Tal says that he even incorporated some motifs that he found in Hillson's books into some of his works, some of his compositions. Now, so this is perhaps a good example that where we see that while many believe that Tal completely ignored Israeli music or Jewish music, we see here that he does indeed relate to it, and even in his electronic compositions, such as in this concerto. Furthermore, I would say that this motif is, the entire piece is actually constructed on this motif. So see, for example, the opening moment of the concerto, where it's actually a condensed form of the third and second. It's C sharp, E flat, F, but if we ignore the sharps and the flats, it's C, E, F. It's the same motif that appears later on. Again, here in the condensed form. And this motif continues to appear throughout this composition. It's really very tightly condensed in its conception. For example, notice this is for in 155 minutes. We see that the motif on the upper staff or in the middle staff, it's D, B, and A. Again, it's an inversion of this theme. Again, we see it in 4 minutes in the lower staffs. In 4 minutes 10, it's another inversion on the theme of on earth and in heaven, except that the earth appears first in an upward motion, and then in heaven appears again. You can see it in C flat, D flat, F. So reception to this piece was largely not positive, to the point that Olga Zibelman, for example, wrote in Ma'ariv, and she questions even the synthesis, the possibility of an efficient synthesis between the electronic music and the acoustic instruments. The critic of Cherut at the time cried out that this piece should be declared as an act of terror, no less. Tal himself was influenced by those negative reviews, to the point that he decided even to archive the piece. As such, he destroyed the magnetic tape, but we do, of course, have the recordings of it and the partiture itself. And I think it's an important composition. That's why I decided to relate to it. So moving on to the fifth piano concerto in 1964. As I've mentioned, each of these compositions has a unique aspect to it. The fifth piano concerto is unusual in that the entire piece is actually constructed as a sort of a perpetual movimento, or a toccata, moving on from one toccata texture to another toccata texture. Tal himself described the fifth piano concerto as a movement that is stereophonically confined by the same thematic material. And indeed, if we look or listen to the opening of the concerto, we can see that the entire piece is constructed on or revolve around a certain tone or in or around a certain tone or sound, without any real, I would say, adherence to any specific tone or note. The aim, of course, was to imitate the linear motion of the magnetic tape. That is, in other words, to strengthen the ties between the electronic apparatus and the acoustic apparatus. So let's listen to the beginning and notice again the repetition of the notes as imitation of the electronics. It is worth mentioning, in my opinion, anyway, that the entire piece is constructed, relies on the toccata, as in many of his works. And I think it should be mentioned that many Israeli composers at the time relied on the toccata in their compositions, in their search for the sound of an early plucked instrument. The toccata seemed to fit into them as an imitation of those instruments. Whether or not Tal's intention was here to imitate those sounds is not clear, but I do think it is worth mentioning. In terms of reception, the fifth piano concerto had some mixed receptions. Yuda Cohen, for example, listening to this piece in Berlin at the time in 1964, commented on the fact that it was very well received by the German audience, and that was in fact very much in rank and similar to other pieces of contemporary composers. In that same year of 1964, Tal also completes his Concerto for harpsichord and magnetic tape. Now, the aim of which I think in the composition for the harpsichord was probably to achieve a better cohesion between the magnetic tape and the harpsichord itself, upon with its metallic tinged sound. So much like the fourth piano concerto or the harpsichord concerto, it is constructed on a nucleus thematic cell, that appears at the beginning of the piece, and you can see the beginning of the harpsichord concerto here. Let's see that. And the entire piece is constructed on this theme. This is, for example, how it appears later on in the beginning of the development. It's actually the exact same motif, as you can tell: A, B flat, A flat. Later on, we see how Tal metamorphoses this theme into an ostinato in the lower step here. Again, the aim was to achieve a better cohesion between the two instruments, and it is also interesting to mention the fact of the way that themes metamorphosis in his compositions, potentially a certain influence by Hindemith, but of course he does not overdevelop his metamorphosis. Now, the harpsichord concerto is really one of Tal's most challenging pieces in terms of listening to it. The reception to it was very much similar. So, for example, I mean, the critic of Herut wrote at the time, "I beg the composer's forgiveness, but this work, Tal's concerto for harpsichord, reminds me of the acoustic results that are derived from eating too much raw cabbage. Later, I was under the impression that a radio station from Ramallah was interfering with the signal. At the very least," writes the critic of Herut, "it sounds like the singing of a raven was a very sore throat." But the lack of understanding that this piece had to deal with, or still has to deal with, is very similar to what we find in other very ultra modern pieces that we find even today. So I would say that upon listening to this piece, the critic of Haaretz wrote something that is very correct, in my opinion. He commented on the chasm, on the gulf that was created between what he describes as the normal concert stage for the wider audience and the special experimental stage for those concierge. And these two concert stages seem to revolve around each other without ever relating to one another. So that is just in relation to modern music. In 1970, Tal completes his last piano concerto for the magnetic tape. And in many ways, it represents a distillment of the same ideas that he was relying on in the earlier compositions. The main drive, or the impetus, I would say, was again to strengthen the affinities between these two. In many ways, also, I'd say the sixth piano concerto is much more efficient in strengthening those ties. And as I mentioned, it's constructed on the same techniques that we saw earlier in the earlier compositions. So, for example, this is the beginning of the piece. You can see that the theme appears in an arpeggiated form, and immediately afterwards, it appears as an ostinato in a vertical appearance. So if it's a tritone and then a second, you see it later on in some seconds later, again, the tritone in a vertical and the second. Let's just do that. So In terms of form, I would say also the sixth piano concerto is the most traditional in relation to form. It closely adheres perhaps to concerto form to some degree, of course. And perhaps this explains why it was better accepted by the critics and by the wider audience. So just to conclude with my last example, I think it shows how Tal was able to confront, or alternatively to unite, the two elements, the acoustic element and the magnetic tape and electronic element. With a listen, for example, for the pseudo sound of a train wheels over the track, emulated by the piano ostinato. The example is not shown. So in short summary, I would say Tal considered to be we know that he was one of the earliest pioneers in electronic music, but his main contribution, at least in my opinion, lies in the development of the concerto for piano and magnetic tape, which he was probably the first, and his achievements in that are unprecedented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gurkiewicz. It's a really that was a really interesting introduction to the piano concertos, and I know that I'm sure people will have some questions to discuss, because electronic music was so important to Josef Tal's achievement, and I mean that particular genre, as well as sort of many other. I'm sure you're also, given more time, you sort of talk about his other electronic scores and things that we can expand on. So just let's move on now and introduce Shoshana Ze'evi, Dr. Shoshana Ze'evi, who is from the literature side of things, but is now working on the vocal music and operas of Josef Tal, and who's going to be talking about the song. Thank you very much indeed. If you'd like to unmute, Dr. Ze'evi would like to unmute, and if you need to share screens, that would be the next thing to do. But I'll just hand over to you then. Thank you very much indeed.
Shall I start, or you would tell me when?
Yes, please. Yes, go ahead. And if you'd like to, whenever you need to illustrate something and you're going to use the share screen
Okay.
when you need to.
Do you hear me properly, yes?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Lamentation on the death of culture in Josef Tal's Mein Blaues Klavier. Is it okay? Do you hear it?
Very loud and clear, thank you. Yeah,
okay.
It's very good.
All right, thank you. Josef Tal composed the lead Mein Blaues Klavier for mezzo-soprano and piano in 1993. It is set to the poem of the Jewish German poet Else Lasker Schiller. The poem appears in her last book, Mein Blaues Klavier, which is a poetic journal that evokes figures from her past, including her mother, deceased son, friends who were lost, and places she had to leave behind when she left Germany in 1939 to immigrate to Jerusalem. Tal's music to Mein Blaues Klavier reflects her own parting from the landscapes of her childhood, a penetrating observation of the cultural fracturing in the mid-20th century, and a dialogue with the Jewish faith. These aspects are reflected in the poem Mein Blaues Klavier through the poetic persona, which combines the personal perspective of the heroine lamenting her destroyed world with the universal outlook which expresses the loss of cultural values. The confluence of these two paths finds expression in the process of change which the poetic persona experiences in the poem. And now I want to show the poem, the poem himself. I hope everything will be okay. No, I can't. No, I'm sorry.
Perhaps Leiran would like to advise. I think it's a question of selecting the screen. If you can, before you share, if you switch off your share, if you can stop sharing, if you can stop sharing, and then and then when you start the share again, but then this time select the screen that has the PowerPoint only, and then make sure that the sound is on.
I don't have it.
As we did it before.
Maybe share, no.
No, you have to stop share again. If you stop share, and then if you just for yourself, put the open the PowerPoint. In the meantime, I'm going to share a link that Eitan Tal has provided us all to a new source, and I'm just putting that in the chat for everybody. I'm sorry for that delay. I'm wondering if we should just have a few minutes to think about what was the last two talks.
I can talk without giving any examples.
Well, it would be nice if you could just share the screen as we did before earlier.
I know. I don't know. Maybe something was wrong.
Can you? If you have to open, you have to open it.
Shall I start from the very beginning?
Well, if you open your PowerPoint, can you see your PowerPoint on your screen?
No, I can't. That's the point. Maybe share.
No. No, you have to unshare again. You have to find the PowerPoint. Perhaps somebody could advise Dr. Ze'evi how just if you can maybe minimize the Zoom.
Okay.
And find the PowerPoint and open it, and then return to the Zoom.
Okay.
השאלה אם תוכלי למצוא את המצגת ולהפעיל אותה, פשוט.
אבל אני לא חושבת שאני משהו הפסדתי. את זה אתם שומעים?
Yeah, we can't hear you, but you just need to activate the PowerPoint. שצריכה להפעיל את המצגת מחדש, כי נראה שהיא גבויה אצלך. דאבל קליק עליה.
על הפאורפוינט?
כן.
כן.
את רואה אותה עכשיו? Can you see it? Can you see your examples?
אתם שומעים?
כן. שומעים.
אתם שומעים?
את הדוגמאות לא. את עכשיו, את רואה את המצגת?
אני רק את זה בלי דוגמה, זה רק השיר. הנה, זאת הדוגמה, עוד לא הגעתי אליה.
I'm just wondering whether
No, I just want to go on reading because this is only the poem, and the music examples are coming later.
okay.
You just carry on talking without
Okay.
them in the.
Without the poem, then I give the music. The process experienced by the poetic persona in the lead articulated through 3 stages of consciousness. In the first stage, she endures estrangement and loss of the self. In the second stage, she has a mystical experience which helps her to overcome the sense of estrangement. In the third stage, she is bestowed with the divine spark, which brings it with spiritual exaltation. Each stage is illuminated in the poem through 3 main images. The first, the blue piano, that symbolizes the loss of its sonorous identity. The second, the mystical figure of the moon lady who restores the lost melody. The third, the persona standing before the gate of heaven, attaining the divine spark. The first stage, the emotional expression attributed to the image of the blue piano, is that it betrayed the original identity. It is entrenched in the world of images, which in modern culture symbolize distortion of humanity, as well as motifs of an anxiety and abandonment. Ansel Ascacillo chose the color blue with its threatening use because, among other things, it symbolizes disintegration of the self in the works of expressionist artists. She enlists these blue motifs and through them embodies the myriad faces of the poetic persona, which is identified with the piano that has lost its sonorous identity. The blue piano serves as the ideal and poetic foundation of everything that takes place in the persona's inner world and in the poetic fabric of the poem. The blue piano represents conceit, which is laden with the multiple layers of symbolic meaning. The color blue forms part of a repository of images that reveal affliction, snobberism, and lack of emotional cultural orientation. This color is part of a system of visual images that carry with them a spiritual and mystical dimension. They induce bleakness and beauty in the conscious processes that the poetic persona undergoes in the blue piano poem. The second stage, in her struggle to restore the identity she has lost, the poetic persona experiences a spiritual metamorphosis. In a new incarnation, she crosses the boundaries of reality to become a divine figure, metamorphosing into a moon lady whose hands are star hands, playing on the piano, thereby restoring the instrument's original purpose. The divine figure grants an ideal and cultural perspective, which serves to illuminate new paths for a purpose. It accords her a new sense of freedom, which she did not experience when in an emotional state of anxiety. However, the persona is aware that the desire for a new experience of freedom is accompanied by many obstacles, which distance her from the freedom she seeks. These obstacles are described in the poem by the rats dancing in the cellar. The rats' dance macabre is reminiscent of the image of dancing Satan, mainstay of German culture and indeed Western culture more broadly since the late Middle Ages. After the dance, she moves to the third stage in which she experiences a spiritual mystical journey which leads to complete connection to God. In this stage, she achieves deep inner salvation, owing to the ability to connect to the divine spark. This connection is accompanied by the recognition that every spiritual redemption is accompanied by human suffering. In the poem, the suffering is described via the image of eating from the bitter bread, and is eternally accompanies the experience of religious exaltation. The sound texture that Josef Tal weaves into the music illuminates the metamorphosis that the poetic persona undergoes through two main musical elements: the distinct rhythmic motifs of the Quintola and the integration of triadic sound in the serial chromatic music. As I will show, the rhythmic element of the Quintola serves as the foundation of the music process that accompanies the poetic process. In the beginning, it symbolizes snowballism and the loss of self. It then goes on to become contrapunctal conversation partner of the Quintola motif in the melody, which restores the piano's sonority identity. However, this return mercilessly accompanied by the satanic red dance. In contrast, Tal represents a harmonic motif, integrating the triad sound in the serial chromatic mechanism. This motif relates to the final stage of the same process, underscoring the transcendental nature of the poetic persona. The two elements constitute part of the structure of the musical work. Initially, with the massive use of rhythmic motif, which accompanies the piano blue color, followed by polyrhythmic relations with the Quintola, when the moon lady is dominated, and finally, the poetic persona. Poetic persona's entrance through the gate of heaven. The sense of divine exaltation ends with a sense of gloom that is extenuated by the cluster of Quintola motif in the instrumental music. Now the Quintola, this is the first one. First music element, emergence of the rhythmic element. And I'm talking about the Quintola. The Quintola motif first appears in the exposition as an instrumental element in the piano music. It takes on a chaotic character, but also expresses the urge to detach from the silence that is imposed on the poetic persona. As I see it, the asymmetrical structure of the accents on each of the Quintola sounds highlights the emotional intensity of the poetic persona, but refusal to accept the silence and the desire to create new poetry. The asymmetrical structure of the accents heightens the sense of snowballism by means of tension that Tal creates between bright color and the high tones of this and of the bright color of the high tones and this small color or cluster with its 4 tones in the low register. Now this is Quintola. עשיתי share screen, לא? זהו, פה ב-11 תלחצי.
Else Lasker Schüler.
לא, ב-11.
Mein Blau.
פה.
Can I suggest that we actually do hear the poem first, since we missed it earlier? I think it would be really nice, you know.
Right. Okay, this one. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Else Lasker Schüler. Mein blaues Klavier.
Do you hear it?
Ich habe zu Hause ein blaues Klavier und kenne doch keine Note. Es steht im Dunkel der Kellertür, seitdem die Welt verrohte. Es spielen Sternenhände 4, die Mondfrau sang im Boote, nun tanzen die Ratten im Geklirr. Zerbrochen ist die Klaviatür, ich beweine die blaue Tote. Ach, liebe Engel, öffnet mir, ich aß vom bitteren Brote, mir lebend schon die Himmelstür, auch wider dem Verbote.
Danke. This is the Quintola. No. The Quintola motif fosters the sense of pain accompanying the persona who does not know any musical note. Ich habe zu Haus ein blaues Klavier. At home I have a blue piano. The experience is reflected in the balisma on the word habe, with melodic trill singing which calls to mind the repository of the Oriental images that characterize some of Lasker Schiller's poem. Tals also endowed the word blouse with melismatic structure, emphasizing the symbolism reflected in the piano's loss of identity. And now the contrapunctal idea. So. Stein. Tal creates an accent on the A sound, which emphasizes the word doch. The agiotic accent of the conjunction takes part of the exalted feelings that accompany the piano. Just as Lasker Schiller created a new interpretation of the concept blue, so Tal provides an interpretation of the modern definition of the music, which undergoes various stylistics and aesthetic changes in the respectable use that he accords to the word doch. In the second time, the Quintola motif appears as a contrapuntal to the quadrupute that characterized the playing of the 4 star hands belonging to the Moon Lady. The contrapunctal relationship between the rhythmic figure, which creates an irregular fabric of the accent, and the melody, in which every beat is divided symmetrically into 4 sounds, shatters the silence of the piano. The melismatic repetition of the word spielen replaces the identity of the voiceless persona, and its place appears in the figure of the Moon Lady, who expresses the urge to live through which she breaks the silence that was forced on the mute persona. The image that describes the Moon Lady with 4 star hands play the piano, conceals the image of the moonlight and harbors the feeling of somnambulism. The somnambulism is heightened by the dance of the rats in the cellar and intensified the dark and nefarious meaning embodied in the blue color and the piano that lost its sonoric soul. Tal accentuates the satanic via the obsessive repetition of the word ratten, rats. Use of ostinato is intended to present the gap between the divine persona and the malicious evil joker who laughs at the fate of men. Shav Shalosh, Shav Allah. I have a problem. I will go on. Lasker Schiller ends the poem with a description of the many faces that characterize the poetic persona. She is endowed with the spiritual, mystical qualities which grant her the ability to understand her mental world, as well as the capacity to rebel against social conventions that repress the human spirit. She is also imbued with the power to eradicate the tyranny that incorporates her spiritual character. The meeting of the rebellion against the convention and the sense of exaltation is expressed in the music through the sonority of the triad chord. Tal utilizes the triad chord in order to present the persona's tormented worldview, described in the poem through the eating of the bitter bread. The structure of the chord does not respond to the syntactic structure of the tonal harmony. It conducts a dialogue with the serial mechanism of the musical sentences that precede it, and it's based on syntactic structure of traditional chord. In this dialogue, Josef Tal elevates the spiritual exaltation of the persona while entering the gate of heaven. He continues to portray the mystical world through the triad chord, but this time he brings back the accompaniment of the quintola, which symbolizes the deranged world with the piano as its main representative. And now the last example sums up the repository of the rhythmic and the melodic figures. Yeah. תנסי עוד פעם את מה עם העכברים. It's the rat. It's a tenor. And now you hear the difference between this and the last one, תנסי עוד פעם את האחרון. Perhaps by the means of traditional melody, Tal attempted to define the poetic persona's spiritual identity as a mystical and rebellious figure. The triad chord in the atonal music refuses to define its identity and belonging. Like the blue piano, which refused to define its identity as a producer of sounds. Similarly, the moon lady plays the piano in the cellar and cannot save the world from the satanic dance of the rat. And this, in fact, is the penetrating statement of that both artists convey, the endeavor to show how the free individual struggles to define spiritual identity in the culture that has lost its human identity. That's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ze'evi, for a wonderful talk. And despite, even with the tension of us awaiting the musical examples, which was they were very welcome. And it's brought us to close the presentation aspect of this evening. But I hope that we've now got the possibility of actually pursuing some points and asking some questions from the floor, and that they should really be addressed to all the speakers in no particular order. And I don't know whether I might be able to be allowed sort of a chair privilege of the chair, as it were, to ask to start the ball rolling. I just wondered. I mean, I have got actually specific questions for everybody, but I'm wondering if maybe I should start with the last paper. So I just had a couple of questions. I mean, it is a very powerful setting, which of this text, which is so resonant with so many strong imagery, and obviously there's sort of the word painting is going on a little bit also on the surface of the sort of ideas of darkness and light, with sort of the use of the sonority of the piano and these sort of abstract qualities as well that you mentioned about the serial, the tonal elements in the serial elements. So I'm just, I was wondering whether, if I could just relate it to, there's another piece that he wrote, a sort of a music theatre piece based on the poetess called Elsa, is that right? Where he
it's a melodrama, yes.
Melodrama, and he, in that melodrama, the text mentions this poem, Ein blaues Klavier, in the middle, and he at the moment that he mentions it in this sort of melodrama, the music suddenly becomes all sort of gushy, romantic type of nostalgic Viennese tonal music. There's a sort of interesting use of parody where Tal sort of goes away from his very modernistic style and sort of has the sort of quotation, and yet here he comes to this poem and has a completely different take on the concept. I'm just wondering, I mean, whether you think that his how the musical language is the sort of traditional elements of, let's say, word setting, which are present here, are maybe subverted somewhere. Do you think that he's this expressionistic style that he's using?
I think he was trying to combine between the expression, because he wrote it almost 20 years after the Elsa homage, and it's not a melodrama; it's a lead, and it has this combination of what we call the expressionist style, and he tried to put it in the music. And I think what I was trying to say, that the rhythmic element is the most important here in this figure, in this poem, in this music. And I was trying to show that he was trying to give some expressive meanings through the rhythmic. And of course, if you have this kind of, anyway, Quintola and Grünthal, they're all traditional elements, and he was using them in such a new way. That's, I think, and with the traditional accord in the surreal music, it was kind of combination, which when you don't know whether it's expressionist, it's a surreal, it's a modern, totally modern. This is Elsa Lasker-Schiller, because Elsa Lasker-Schiller in her poem, she is presenting a world which is going to end, and that's what he was trying to give in the music. You don't know the beginning, you don't know the end. You start with the Quintola, we end with the Quintola. That's what we're doing. We start with the very bleak and light, and we end with that, and then you put the satanic dance inside, and this is a process that leads from the end, from the nowhere to nowhere, as if you don't know where to go, if you don't know where to end. That's what he was trying to do in the music. That's what I think. I feel it.
Would you say that, I mean, there's a sort of element of the German Lied style here, that he's actually almost going back into a sort of 19th century approach?
I was trying, I was singing Schumann for a long time, and I don't know, and maybe Richard Strauss, and some of the Fremde in the Nacht, but I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. He was trying to put, his kind of connection of a woman who is metamorphosing such kind of emotional evaluation from the very beginning, which is she's nothing, and then she's coming to an exaltation, spiritual exaltation. That's what I feel. And he was trying to be just forcing. I think that Josef Tal is a very spiritual and transcendental, and I find a transcendental element in his music. And I saw it in his piece. I saw it here and I saw it in Elsa. And I'm writing some other research, of course, in his operas. And Elsa was a mirror, a reflection of what he was thinking of a man who was, on the one hand, has lost his connection to the past, to the culture, to what he was combined, and on the other hand, he's trying to figure some other kind of spirit, some other kind of connection with a new touch. She was kind of reflection of what I think of what he was thinking, if I know his music.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you so much. And I noticed that Yehosh has got questions, and I'm sure other people, so I'm going to withhold my other questions to the others. And Yehosh, if you'd like to.
Yeah, just one clarification. We cannot compare the Blaues Klavier to Elsa. With the Blaues Klavier, we have a poem by Elsa Lasker-Schiller, whereas Elsa is a melodrama by Israel Eliraz, written in Hebrew and translated into German, which tells about Elsa's life in Jerusalem. So they're actually different kind of compositions altogether.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I was just making the connection because I mentioned the piece. But anyway, so have we got some other questions? Either raise your hand or put them in the chat box, and unmute if anyone would like to ask. If not, I'm going to ask my other questions to the other speakers while everybody's thinking. So if I go in reverse order, if I can take, I don't see any hands up, but I'd like to first of all congratulate Leiran on bringing out this very important part of the oeuvre, the electronic music. And I just wondered if I could ask, I mean, you were focusing on certain moments, let's say, in the piano concertos. And I was wondering what you think in general the role of the magnetic tape is, and to what extent what was going on there creatively in the electronic aspect, and how does it relate to, if at all, how does it relate to the piano part? You know, how does Tal's contrapuntal working, which we've already seen in the last piece, and obviously in the concerto, how does it express itself? And does it also happen in, let's say, non-piano concerto electronic works, like the many sort of theatre scores and ballet scores that he wrote? Do you have something on that?
Yes, thank you. So I would say that his approach, I would say that the concerto is very much similar to a very conventional concerto. And that's why he turned it as concerto, because in many other ways, I mean, you would even question the title of a concerto. We know, of course, that the idea of concerto, let's say, for example, a Brahms concerto was so as to confront those two elements of the soloist and the orchestra. The two are often in dialogue with each other, in strife or complementing each other. That's what I think Tal was aiming at in this concerto. That's why sometimes you would find moments where I picked on several, I emphasized or I showed several moments where you can see how the two are in affinity to some degree with each other, whether complementing each other, whether fighting with each other, you might say, or conversing with each other, but that will be the main point throughout the composition. And that's what I think Tal was aiming at. Also similar to in his other compositions in his other concertos. So that's what I think the main point would be. And
would you find that there are actual, imitations and things like this, or is that too going a bit too far? And we heard a few extracts. You gave us a very short extract. Of this sort of sustained type of electronic sound against which the piano can come out very clearly. And I'm just interested in how Tal is producing that, and does it change over the concerto, during the course of the concertos? Is he experimenting more in that type of coloration?
Absolutely. I would say that throughout the composition, throughout the concertos, he deals with different permutations of expression between these two elements, between the acoustic and the magnetic tape. And you would see different expressions of it. Sometimes it would be in imitation, sometimes as a reaction to the magnetic tape. And these two seem to converse with each other throughout the composition. Like, that's what
that's really fascinating. I see that we have here actually a wonderful array of musicians present, and particularly Tzipi Fleischer, who I'd like to welcome to our Zoom session. And I know that Tzipi, you've used electronics in your scores, and I just wondered were you influenced? Do you have a relationship with Joseph Tal's music in terms of like influence? Was he an important? How did his electronic music sort of get known, and or do you use a different style? And do you want to speak at all? No, sorry. I'm sure that there must have been some, certainly in the 1960s, when it was, as it were, a really new medium, that this must have had a great impact on composers at around the same time, that they were suddenly new possibilities were being opened up there. And the interaction, obviously, what would he have done now with the software? That's amazing. And Hirsch is going to comment. Thanks.
I would like to add that Tal was influenced very much Zvi Avni, who very shortly afterwards started his own electronic music, but both of them wrote for electronic sound together with instruments. I think it was very important that they wrote very little pure electronic sound. They needed the live experience. And I'm talking as a person who is not a great connoisseur of electronic music. I think that they needed Tal was a truly great pianist. He was the first one to perform Brahms' first piano concerto in Israel. And he needed the experience of a live player together with the electronic sound, which enriches the sound, but is not the soul experience.
Yes, it's that interaction, the combination. Certainly when you look at the sort of theatrical or ballet scores, it's that sort of the idea of movement interacting in that situation with the electronics as well, or drama that seems to excite the imagination there. There's some really amazing scores which include voices as well, acoustic voices as well as the electronics, and it really is stunning. And I have to actually thank Eitan Tal, who's actually put an extra link into our chat box, but for enabling all this music to be experience. So I hope that more and more people will listen. And I've noticed that hundreds of listening, that if you look on the recordings, hundreds of views, as it were, have already happened. So that's a good thing. Yossi, you've got a hand up, I think. So go ahead. If you unmute.
In the mid-80s, Josef Tal had a series of lectures in Galei Tzahal on the radio broadcasting. And then I recall that I heard it. It spoke about his electronic music. He demonstrated them. And he said that the piano part is much more developed than the electronic part, for technical constraints, that it should be a sort of something that is a sort of equality between the piano and the electronic and the tape, but in fact the piano part is much more developed, and this was due to technical constraints. So this is what he himself introduced in these radio talks to the general public.
May I add, if it's okay for me to add, that I think that he also writes about that Tal was very much aware of the shortcomings, specific shortcomings that he had in relation to other composers that I've mentioned, such as Stockhausen. He was aware that he cannot compete with Stockhausen or with Pierre-Henry in terms of the equipment that they had, simply because he did not have the sufficient financing. On the other hand, he was also very much aware of his specific advantages that I've mentioned, of him being a virtuoso pianist, something that other people could not, that he was able to develop that aspect. Of course, Stockhausen was not a pianist. He could not overdevelop that part of the composition. That's why, for example, as I've mentioned, if you listen to compositions, different compositions by Stockhausen or Pierre-Henry, they don't have, you would not find such specific, over-sophisticated, elaborate passages of pianistic compositions that you find in Josef Tal, simply because Tal was a virtuoso pianist. And that is, so he elaborated, let's say, on his strong points. He emphasized what he knew was his abilities. That's what I wanted to mention.
Yeah, that's really important. Thank you. So that's really a good aspect to consider, and especially in all the accompaniment. I mean, the accompaniment of the song. That's fairly virtuoso piano score on its own. I wanted to. I did have a question for Yossi after your talk about the double concerto, and it's sort of connected with Leiran's talk about the sort of concerto number 6, where you mentioned that Tal is sort of more, as you were, traditionalist in terms of concerto form. And I was wondering, after your analysis, of the motive of the serial sort of elements, let's say in the double concerto, I was wondering about whether you might think about, and you mentioned the recapitulation, which sort of suggests sonata or some sort of a concerto form. I was wondering about, the ritornello elements of concerto and the way that Tal sort of really uses the solos between the two instruments, followed by the tuttis, followed by the solo, followed by the tutti in this sort of arrangement. Whether you can maybe elaborate a little bit on the way that he does that, because and the relationship between the violin and the cello is really interesting as well, whether they at times they seem very closely, what you might expect, sort of intertwined, echoing each other, and you showed that happening with the row. At the end, there's a sort of, they separate out. They've got this long violin solo, and then you have the long cello solo. It's almost as if there's the cadenza or something. If you were like, that's the bit which we've sort of been waiting for, and then the sort of orchestra comes in. Is there an element of traditionalism in terms of form there going on? And can you talk about it a bit?
Well, I don't think it is a traditional, not traditional ritornello. In the criticism of, there is a newspaper clip in the Josef Tal website where Benny Pearl, as a young critic, said this, well, this is now a more traditional work than the electronic works that preceded it. But no, even when there is a sort of recapitulation, it is the changes are so multiple and so overwhelming, so it requires a lot of hearing and sort of analytical hearing to notice it. And then there are these elements that, sometimes, this is similar in contour. The other items catch the ear more than the structural items. So it is a matter of the philosophy of listening. Do we regard the items that catch the ear as disturbances, as not excellent enough a listening that is not attained to the true content? Or do we accept it that some items that might be more ad hoc improvisatory, has more ad hoc improvisatory drive, are nevertheless at the bottom line are the main essence of the piece for the listening experience?
I mean, I know that you, being a very highly experienced listener, can detect all sorts of, things going on from the theoretical angle, as well as, just sort of experiencing it. And I mean, particularly you're interested in the sort of the harmonic aspect, meaning the use of the row or the ways that it's being loosely used. I'm just thinking of things like concerto elements, let's say, like the dialogue element or these sort of things, which seem to be present there. Therefore, it's sort of there for the audience, and you could say that he's definitely, it's a dramatic piece. It's got all of the dramatic elements. I mean, we heard about the operas and mentioned, and there's this sort of interaction which is so necessary to make it an effective piece. I mean, I find that aspect is that the free element? Is this the sort of improvisatory sort of thing you're talking about?
I did not find a clear, strict organization of this aspect. In general, the orchestral climaxes that are very intense sound less organized than the solo portions that have more options, options to hear nuances. But I give you a certain example when I talked about that the recapitulation starts, and then one of the aspects that complicate it, the overlap with preceding sections. So there is a solo violin without the cello, then the recapitulation of the moment that is like the very opening of the piece, that this is a sort of beginning of the recapitulation. Then comes the solo of the cello. So there are two equal or analogous solo portions, but the recapitulation begins in the middle between both of them. So if you look at where is the structural point of new beginning, so where should we divide the piece? So what we do in analysis, we divide pieces into sections. So on one aspect, it is a clear beginning on a point that is analogous to measure one. But on the other aspect, it in the middle between two solos. So this is
so he varies it. I mean, it expands, as you said. Yes, you mentioned sort of
overlap between. This is an overlap between two strategies that both are audible, but they're in conflict with each other.
Does anybody have something that would like to bring up?
I might mention something.
Leiran, great.
Yeah, because what Yossi is talking about, actually, I noticed some similarities to the Fifth Piano Concerto. Again, I think that Tal did a very clever job at avoiding a very specific theme or even form in the Fifth Piano Concerto. This, I would say, in contradiction, for example, to the Fourth Piano Concerto or the Sixth, where you do indeed see a very specific form or specific themes that he relies on. As I've mentioned, you could see that he has a specific nucleus thematic cell with which the piece opens, and you can see how he develops it. Nothing traditional as far as let's say concerto sonata form, because he does avoid that. He comes somewhat close to that in the Sixth Piano Concerto, but he definitely, I would say, tries to avoid something traditional. In that sense, he is, I would say, exceptionally modern. Even in his, let's say, the compositions themselves are very challenging. So in that, I can relate to what Yossi is mentioning here, that you cannot really find anything to grab onto. The Fifth Piano Concerto is a wonderful example that you practically can't find a theme. I mean, that's what I wanted to mention.
Okay, thank you. I wanted just to sort of round it off. Something that Yehoash might want to comment on. I had this sort of idea. I've been listening to a lot of Joseph Tal recently, thanks to the website, largely, and to your wonderful talks last week and this week. And I'm just thinking back a few months where we had a session with Asaf Sheleg. And something that he brings up, and I think Ronit Setter was here earlier on and had to leave, has also commented on this idea of Hebrewism and Israeliness, and we had this last week as well. And I think what the thought that Asaf Sheleg has in his book, his first book, which is Jewish Continuities, he says that on the one hand, Joseph Tal is sort of somehow rejects the Hebrewism, and on another hand, he expands it to include what he's doing. That, in other words, he's not completely moving away from what was, let's say, the national style. And you've mentioned, we've already had Leiran pointing out that he does actually use materials, as we heard also last week in the symphonies. The way that he uses them is quite different, let's say, from Ben Chaim and from other composers. And the question is, it's a little bit like Beethoven, when you sort of say, is he a classical or romantic composer? You know, to what extent do we think Tal was really expanding the language or the Israeli style to somehow accommodate this type of different way of using the material that could derive from the traditional elements and topics. So that sort of awareness of both, he wants to get away from the very Israeliness that is sort of maybe surrounding him, that he wants to go on his own path, but on the other hand doesn't want to completely do that. And in fact, he's very drawn to being an Israeli composer. Is that?
Yes, well, I can just round off and say that Tal in general remained a German composer. As I said, half of his operas are German, full length. And Tal opposed the so-called Mediterranean music. There is no Mediterranean style. That's a bad term. But it's very sort of popular, like style of Lavry, with all its advantages. Tal opposed it completely. He opposed the artificial nationalism, which was forced on Israeli music in its early years. and Tal remained a European composer and a classical composer in the sense that he wrote in every possible genre. And Chaim did not write a single opera, although he was a great opera conductor, whereas with Tal, most of his works were operas, 11 stage works. So Tal has an incredible richness in his music. And I hope that the book, when it comes out and hopefully appear also in English, will reflect some of its richness.
Well, thank you. I know there's going to be lots of more to say on that question and sort of others. But I mean, having the book and being able to hear the music is going to make a huge difference so that we can sort of have a bigger session. Perhaps we can have a conference on Josef Tal's music in the future, amongst others, or a symposium. But for now, I think, yes, we had this discussion about German and Israeli before, so maybe we don't want to sort of stifle that one. But I think for now, there aren't any pressing. We've covered a lot of genres, and I'd just like to thank everybody for their contributions from last week. Michael Wolper, of course, for his wonderful talk on the symphonies. Hirshberg, thank you for not only helping out today with many comments, but also your talk last week, which you presented, and also as everybody, Leiran, Josef, and Shoshana Ze'evi, for your contributions. And we look forward to reading the chapters in the book very soon. I think I should mention thanks also to Eitan Tal for being here, and as well as for giving us the links, because your presence is very much appreciated. And I'm sure you have wonderful things to say yourself, but about your father, which would be a topic for another session, perhaps. But anyway, thank you. We'll end the session here soon. I think if anyone wants to mention next week's program, well, next week actually there's a special
I'll come in about that,
2 weeks time is the actual next program. So Geraldine
I'll
will
talk
introduce.
about next week. So I want to thank you, Malcolm, for chairing this whole session wonderfully. And really, we have to give thanks to you for the whole idea of COZ. Everybody should know that this was Malcolm's brainwave, that people should be able to talk together. And I think what we've created here, we thought maybe once a month, once every fortnight, it would happen. But since we started in June 2020, there's been a session every week. And, we're very grateful to all the speakers, but it's an extraordinary breadth of scope of Jewish music. And the wonderful thing is that many people come back week after week, regardless whether that's their particular theme or not. So I think we've greatly fertilized the whole era, the whole arena of Jewish music studies. And the idea of up to 2 hours when you can listen to music, you can talk, you can chat, is something that has been very special. And it's possible that people won't want to go back to the sort of formula of a conference where you have to have 20 minutes and off because the next person's coming on. It's created a whole new arena for discussing Jewish music. But as you say, next week, we're into something really interesting. Again, Moroccan Jewish music. And we'll be tuning into a session given by, let me just make this a smaller screen and I'll see. The person who's going to be talking is Samuel Torjman Thomas, discussing music and Moroccan Jewish identity. he's talking about how particularly the synagogue and the joint music, the people together singing creates an identity and creates something very special. So something that our dear friend Judith Frigesi also feels, that the music of the synagogue, where people are singing together in a cultural way, one of the peaks of Jewish culture and one of the greatest achievements of human expressive behavior. So we'll be hearing this. It's a talk that he's given to the HUC program, but he'll be there to answer questions, and there'll be other people of Moroccan extraction being able to answer questions as well. So we very much look forward to seeing you next week for Moroccan Jewish music and identity. So thank you all once again. Thank everybody for being able to have this expansive question. Yehoash, lovely to do it, and we wish the book every success with all the chapters of everybody.
Thank
So
you very much. Thank you all.
Okay, so thank you
Thank
all
you
very much.